For 60 years, Israelis and Palestinians have searched for peace, unable to forge an agreement that provides land and security to both peoples. Why does all the talk lead to nothing? The U.S. initiated the current round of negotiations, saying it supported both a secure Israel and the creation of a Palestinian state that is viable, contiguous, sovereign, and independent. However, the U.S. also said that new realities on the ground, the results of Israeli occupation of the West Bank, must be allowed to remain. What are these new realities? More than 200 Israeli settlements and outposts occupy areas of prime land and water. Israeli military zones and nature preserves are off limits to Palestinians. Israeli-only highways, checkpoints, and roadblocks further carve up the territory. Finally, the separation barrier and its buffer zone push deep into the West Bank. The U.S. government sees what remains as a viable, contiguous, sovereign, and independent Palestinian state. Do you?
Hi, my name is Anna, and I'm here to tell you about my experiences working with a group called the International Women's Peace Service, which is based in the West Bank, and basically we do two things. First of all, we're there to document human rights abuses in the region, and second of all, we're there to support nonviolent resistance to the occupation. Settlements in the territories are essentially communities of Jewish Israelis who are living on Palestinian land. And they may be sort of villages, towns, cities. Here's a rather large one near Bethlehem in Jerusalem. And again, all of this land here is Palestinian land. It belongs to the Palestinians. It's internationally recognized as Palestinian land. And yet there's this city that's been built on top of it that is exclusively for Jewish Israelis. Well, what does this mean? Who gets to live in that city? Well, I could live in that city, right? Because I'm Jewish. I would just have to fill out an application. I could move there next week if I wanted to. And yet the farmers, the Palestinians that own the land that the city was built on, aren't allowed to live in it. Now, this process is nothing new. It's happened throughout history, all over the world, and there's a name for it. It's called colonization. And it's interesting that in English and in Hebrew we have this kind of benign word, settlements, whereas in many languages, like French for example, these settlements are called colonies, and that's exactly what they are. And they are illegal according to international law, which prohibits an occupying power from transferring citizens from its own territory to the occupied territory, which is exactly what Israel's doing. Instead of working against the system, though, Israel actually promotes it, as you can see in this photograph, which shows a billboard on an Israeli-only road in the Palestinian territories, and it basically says, it's in Hebrew, it says, "Now more than ever," and underneath it says, basically, if you come to our community, to Ariel, which is a settlement, if you come to live in Ariel, you will be rewarded with 100,000 Israeli shekels. That's more than 20,000 US dollars. In other words, the Israeli government is actually paying its own citizens to move from Israel proper to the occupied territories to become part of the illegal occupying population. And what's particularly interesting to me about this billboard is who is it targeting? Who are going to be the Israelis who uproot their families to go live on this foreign land because it's cheaper to do so? Is it going to be well-off, wealthy, established Israeli families? No, they want to live in Tel Aviv. The families who end up taking advantage of these offers are going to be low-income Israelis, poor Israelis, recent immigrants from Africa, from Eastern Europe. And in fact, a lot of these settlements, Ariel included, are populated primarily by immigrants who've moved to the territories, not because they say this land is ours and nobody else's, but because they're looking for a higher standard of living. And these financial offers can be very appealing. People who take advantage of them will get nice housing, oftentimes with mortgages subsidized by the government. There are parks for their kids to play in, strip malls, swimming pools, in a place where water is so precious. A nice offer, right? Again, all of this built illegally on Palestinian land. At this point, there are settlements all over the West Bank. The red dots in this map indicate where you have an illegal Jewish-only colony built on Palestinian land. And of course, coming along with the settlements and colonies is the road network. And here you can see it's just a handful of them, but the way those blue roads and highways really chop up, compartmentalize that Palestinian landscape. Remember, of course, that these roads were built illegally on Palestinian land, and that the Palestinians owning the land that they were built on, for the most part, aren't even allowed to use them because of the segregated road system.
The settlements were constructed right from the start for one and a single reason, which is to demonstrate to the Palestinians that this land is ours and that they have no future on this land.
Many settlements start off with a small group of trailers on a hilltop. Bit by bit they grow, and they grow, and they grow, from tiny outposts to major population centers stretching as far as the eye can see. Most of these colonies sit on privately owned Palestinian land. Nearly 500,000 Israelis now live in these subsidized homes. They get to work on a network of roads constructed exclusively for the use of Israelis. The massive separation wall snakes in and out of the West Bank and Jerusalem, following the contours of these colonies.
Settlements are now a threat to the very existence of the State of Israel. And if we do not get rid of those settlements, we will have, on the long run, to get rid of the State of Israel. There's no future to Israel with settlements. And settlements endanger our security. Settlements are the greatest embodiment of injustice to the other side and the perpetrators of the occupation and subjugation of the Palestinians.
The idea that this is our country, we've now grown our country. Now the trick is, how do we keep it and keep control of the land and make this all the land of Israel, but get rid of the Palestinian population? That, until today, from 1967 until today, remains the essential issue. Sharon was appointed by Begin to be the head of the Ministerial Committee on Settlements. Sharon was charged by Begin with two things. One, to create facts on the ground, settlements, roads, infrastructure, everything. Facts on the ground that make it impossible to disconnect Judea and Samaria from Israel, to make Israel's presence irreversible, and secondly, to foreclose forever the establishment of a Palestinian state. You can't explain the major elements of the occupation by security. You can't explain 200 settlements by security. Israel did not go out and build Ma'ale Adumim for security reasons, and it never claimed to. You can't explain the highway system. You can't explain the policy of house demolitions. You can't explain land expropriation. You can't explain really the closure, the way it's done, because most of the closure is internal, within the West Bank and within Gaza, not between them and Israel. And you can't explain the route of the wall by security. Security simply does not explain these things. Something else is going on.